shouted louder, louder than before. We've got a song to sing and we'll never stop giving all to you. Joy is alive in this place. Freedom is here.
Well, welcome again to this week's devotions, and we're returning to the book of Acts, this remarkable story that Luke tells us about the adventure, the journey of the early church. And it truly is a remarkable story, one that I believe can connect with our individual lives as well as our corporate life together. Let me read this morning from Acts chapter 6, and I'm just going to read verses 1 through to 5. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers, choose 7 men from among you, full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our intention to prayer and to the ministry of the word." This proposal pleased the whole group. One of the most basic things you learn in sport, particularly if there's a ball involved, is that somehow you have to keep your eye on the ball, otherwise it's going to fall, you're not going to catch it. If it's a cricket ball, it could result in some serious injury. So you always have to keep your eye on the ball. Don't get distracted, don't look away, don't overthink it, just simply focus on the ball coming and the ability that you need to have to actually catch it successfully. Growth in the church brings challenges as well as blessings, of course. And one thing is very clear about this church in Jerusalem is that despite the persecution that they're facing, despite what we read in our previous week's devotions about the terrible story of Ananias and Sapphira, who tried to deceive not only the church, but tried to deceive God. Despite all of that was happening, the church was continuing to grow significantly. More and more people were becoming disciples of Jesus. What a blessing church growth is. All of us, of course, want to grow. But we recognize that with growth comes challenges. Changes need to happen. How you organize and structure a church of 50 people is, of course, very different to the way that you will organize and structure a church of 150 people, and so on. And of course, here we see that the church, thrilled no doubt by church growth, is also becoming increasingly aware that inevitably this will bring challenges. If Satan cannot suppress the church through persecution, if he cannot corrupt the church through deception, then how about trying that one thing that possibly has been more of a hindrance to the church through its long history than anything else? And that, of course, is to distract the church, to get its eye off the ball. And one of those ways, perhaps one of the most significant ways, is through disunity. The church in Jerusalem was made up of a number of different groups, but primarily two dominant groups. One we can see mentioned here, which were called the Grecian Jews. They were Hellenistic speakers. They were Greek. They came from a Greek background and had probably been born outside of Israel. They had lived in exile, and they had returned to Jerusalem, maybe for work, or to return to the place that related to their national identity. They spoke Greek. The other group, of course, were Hebraic Jews, Jews that were native. They had grown up in and around Jerusalem, Judea, maybe into the border areas of Israel, but nonetheless, they had been brought up and nurtured within Israel as a country. And of course, they primarily would have spoken Hebraic. And so you have these two groups, very influential and strong groups, and very diverse groups in many ways within the church. And soon there's a cause of division. The division is that the Grecian Jews feel that their widows are being neglected when it comes to the distribution of support for very vulnerable widows. Now, whether or not that was true, one thing that we can say for sure is that it was beginning to become an issue of disunity. It was felt that that was unfair, and that the Hebraic Jews, those who were native, well, their widows were obviously being prioritized when it came to the distribution of help and support. The 12, who are providing leadership in the church, could so easily have seen this as a very important issue and one that they needed to personally get involved with. And if they had seen it that way, that would meant that they would have been caught up in that rather than doing the very thing that God particularly was asking of them. So note here, they very wisely refuse to get distracted by this. They won't get caught up in it because they believe that their calling is to the ministry of God's words. However good and important the task is, they will delegate it to others. Otherwise, they will become distracted and diverted. They will take their eye off the ball from the very thing that God was asking of them. I wonder this morning if we could reflect on that, whether or not at times we've got caught up in doing very good and important things, but they're a distraction. They've taken us away from those things that God particularly asks of us. And if we're aware of those things, how will we correct that in a way that enables us to refocus on those things that God particularly has for us?
You set our hearts on fire in the dead of night.